Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome you to our conversation this afternoon with General Mick Ryan, retired Major General in the Australian Army, to talk about White Sun War, a book that our in-house Joshua Huminski, director of the Mike Rogers Center, has written an excellent review of, which I will drop in the chat for folks in just a few minutes and recommend you take a look at if you haven't already. But we're pleased to have General Ryan here. As many of you who are tuning into this conversation are aware, the center has been studying great powers conflict for some time, and we've been delving into both the historical lessons, the sort of current events as we're observing them, the intricacies of some of the both military and economic challenges that we face in competition with China, and also looking at some fictional portrayals of the way things might go in the future, by way of helping us understand what scenarios we might need to be prepared for, and the purposes of benefiting our thinking on what we might need to do to prepare ourselves now for those potential future scenarios. So we're really pleased to have Major Ryan with us. I really like your background, General. Excuse me. I meant to say General Ryan. Major General Ryan, really like your background. But we're excited to have you here today, and looking forward to hearing your description of what motivated you to take on the project of writing White Sun War, and then entering a conversation led by Joshua Huminski to delve into some of the key questions and some of your key findings and unpack that for our audience. I think Joshua will be soliciting questions from our audience as well. So, General, thank you so much for offering us the time, for putting the intellectual work into this book, and for being with us today. So let me, with that, turn it over to Joshua Huminski to get us going with the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Representative Nye, and Major General Ryan. I have to echo Representative Nye's thanks for joining us for today and for writing what is an absolutely fantastic book. I love techno thrillers. I'm a little jaded about techno thrillers these days because they seem to be a dime a dozen that don't really add very much. Yours, however, adds a lot to the conversation and does it in such a superb way. I want to give you the floor first to open up here. What made you decide to write this book, and what made you decide to take a fictional account to what we've certainly in Washington have been discussing a lot about, which is a potential war between the United States and China over Taiwan?
Well, thank you, Glenn, firstly, for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation to talk here today. To your question, Joshua, I had written a book that was released just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 called War Transform, which was non-fiction and looked at a range of trends that were impacting on contemporary and likely future military operations. And I wanted to take those trends as a start point and apply them to the real world. I could do that in a non-fiction account, which would perhaps mirror many of the reports that we see emanating from think tanks, or I could do it in a different way that was more accessible and more readable to a wider variety of people. The thing with non-fiction books is they're read by a smaller proportion of people than fiction. And humans have, thousands of years of passing on information through storytelling. So I decided to use the medium of fiction, which has a long history in exploring the future of military operations, whether it's more recent things like Peter Singer and August Cole's magnificent Ghost Fleet, the stuff out of the 1980s and 90s, Red Storm Rising, Third World War, or back to the very birth of the military techno thriller, which was The Battle of Dorking, written in the 1870s by a British Royal Engineers officer. And some of the fiction from the turn of the century, which also tried to come to grips with big changes in technology that were occurring before the First World War. So that's a long way of saying, I wanted to try something different that looks at military operations and military people, and hopefully that would educate the general public and make military leaders think.
I think it does that so superbly. One of the takeaways that I had from this book, and I would love to know if this is actually by design, was every interaction within this book. And for viewers and listeners at home, this is going to be a spoiler-free discussion here, because I very much hope you pick this book up and enjoy it yourselves. One of the things that I took away from this was every conversation and interaction was very concept-driven. It was not focusing on a technology, though that's there. It wasn't focusing specifically on, the Jack Ryan character of the world that saves the day. It was every interaction from, the Chinese officers to their American counterparts to the civilians in the Pentagon was very much a vehicle to talk about everything from subterranean warfare to artificial intelligence to additive manufacturing. And it was such a novel way to approach it. And I'm curious if you went into it with that mentality and by design, or if that's just sort of how the book project evolved.
No, that's very definite. I mean, the thing with techno thrillers is they very much focus on the technology. I'm not a fan of silver bullets in war. I don't think there is such a thing. Technology helps. But as Andrew Marshall once wrote, it's actually the best ideas and the best organizations that win out. And we really have to understand that in evolving our military capabilities is another trinity that we have to focus on besides the Clausewitzian one, which is the trinity of technology, ideas and organizations, which all have to evolve in concert. And it's when you get those right that you develop transformative military and national security capabilities. We're at that period of human history where there are fairly profound changes in technology. Artificial intelligence, robotic systems, hypersonics, new materials technologies that could result in another revolution in military affairs. Could, I say, I'm not saying is at the moment, but could. And new ideas are a part of that, and ideas that have been out there for the last few years or might be needed in future was a real focus of mine in writing the book.
This book, as you said, very much builds off your previous book, War Transformed, which I thoroughly enjoyed and highly recommend as well. One of the takeaways that I had from White Sun War was you're very optimistic about the direction of certainly the Pentagon, but I would loosely say the sort of Western alliance, if you will, about being in a position in 2028 when the conflict takes place to have addressed everything from battery technology to AI to supply chain security. And I'm curious, where did you get that sort of optimism from? And where would you assess that sort of the real world implications of where we are today into getting to those positions in the future?
Well, I began this book before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this was pretty speculative that we could fix these major challenges back then. But I think the Russian major invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has provided a shock to the global system and a shock to national governments with regards to a whole range of things, but importantly around supply chains, around stock holdings of munitions, around logistics, around long-range strike. This book is set about 5 years into the future. Even before the war in Ukraine, Indo-Pacific and others had begun to really focus on this challenge. The US DoD and the National Security Strategy for the United States had begun to focus on this challenge. And whilst when the United States changes, it might take a little while to make that turn. Once the turn's done, it's very much a get out of the way kind of moment for adversaries. So, I'm an optimist about, the United States and its capacity for change and adaptation. And I think that comes through in the story.
One of the other bits that I found interesting as well, it was how this was not just an American-centric story, although the main characters very much are American Marines and whatnot. But you also talk about that allied ecosystem. I mean, you have references to your home country of Australia, the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. And I'm curious, when you look at that broader Indo-Pacific architecture, where you see the situation today and where you envision it sort of in 5 years' time. And we just had the AUKUS agreement between the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, but also the Quad and other elements. How much of that informed this specific scenario, and where do you see it going in the real world?
Well, my own personal experiences of traveling to and serving with Americans well, since I was 10 years old, pretty much, has informed this. I served with US forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, have spent a lot of time living there over the last 15 years or so. So my knowledge of US forces and how they see allies inform the book. But, it's also an attempt to say to people, listen, Asia's not like Europe. You can't just take the NATO template and lay it down on the Western Pacific. That's just not possible. There is no Asian version of NATO. It is extraordinarily unlikely there ever will be. The security architecture there is very different. And you need to understand that. And in many respects, the United States is the hub of a series of relationships and alliances and security partnerships that will be essential to restricting Chinese aggression and coercion over the next few decades. And I wanted to portray that as something that's more complex and more difficult to manage than NATO, which is by no means an easy undertaking politically or militarily. At the end of the day, there's a couple of major players in the Western Pacific, which is Japan, Taiwan, Korea. And then, everyone else, as we've seen with Ukraine, is looking at conflict through their own individual interests. They're not always values driven like we are. And you can't always count on the wholesome, full-scale support of every country in the region like you would in a conflict that involves NATO.
Building off of that, one of the things I also took away from this book was I very much saw this as a book that you could have your individual service member take with them and almost use as professional military education. Each one of these conversations, to your point, rightly made about the complexity of the Indo-Pacific security architecture, each one of these chapters is almost a lesson plan, if you will. And I'm curious if that was part by design, we're using that concept idea, but taking it to the average Marine service member, sailor, airman, or now Space Guardian, and I do want to get back to space, if that was kind of one of the key takeaways you hope people would have with this book.
Yeah, it really is a book of little stories that are part of a larger conflagration, like every war is. Every individual is a very small part of a very big story. And I wanted to pick stories that were relevant to the contemporary military, not one we imagined from the past, which is why you have the kind of characters I have from the kinds of backgrounds that they're from and the services they're from. And I wanted to tell a story of how new organisations might contribute to future warfighting and military capability in a way that older ones do not. And, Space Force, Marine Littoral Regiment, and organisations that, have very high densities of autonomous systems were part of that design. I wanted people to really think about what's coming and less about what they've done in the past.
If I can build off of that, one of the things I thought was quite interesting was the marrying, and this is not a spoiler, the marrying of the Army units with the Marine Littoral and their deployment into the theater. One of the interesting things, as you well know, was the recent reaction to the Force Design 2030 that came out and the almost institutional antibody reaction that resulted from that, which seemed to be illustrative of one of the lessons you talk about in War Transformed, was the importance of institutional change and adaptation. And I'm curious if looking at through the lens of the story, but then also that very real world reaction to an organization that was attempting to innovate and adapt, what do you see as that reflecting? And is that an example of kind of how you see things going forward? Do we learn the lessons from that reaction, or kind of what is the direction you think certainly the core will go in, but what does that speak to about broader institutional adaptation?
Yeah, this is a debate I've followed very closely. A lot of my friends are at the 2 and 3 star level in the Marine Corps and have been at the heart of the development of Marine Littoral Regiment. I led work here in Australia in 2013 that developed a concept that was very similar as part of how we thought we might be able to work, called archipelagic manoeuvre. You can still read it online. We chose not to go that way at that particular time. But things like dispersed operations, long-range maritime strike, lowering your signature so you're easier to disappear into the noise, are all part of the Marine Corps concept under General Berger. I mean, it's innovative. It's a service that's really struggling hard to come up with effective and survivable and lethal and protected ways of working in a bit of the earth that's very, very different to what European militaries have to deal with. And things like debates about the removal of tanks, it's everything's context specific, right? I don't support it in my military, getting rid of tanks, but with the Marines, it's very different. I mean, at worst case, if this fails, this whole concept fails, I don't think it will, but if it did, you still have the US Army that has thousands of tanks, has a big presence in the Pacific and has for a very long time. So, I'm a big fan of what General Berger is trying to achieve with the Marine Corps. It's not just what he's doing with the Marine Corps that I admire. He's setting an example for other services to really seriously look at their force structure, but more importantly, how they think, how they develop their leaders, and how they train their people for the wars to come, not the wars we've fought in the past. So, I think there's lots to look at, lots to admire in what the Marines have done and are doing. In a democracy, debate about new ideas is healthy and it's welcome. But at some point, you've just got to get on with the business and implement. And that's what the Marines are doing. And, I really look forward to seeing how it plays out.
One of the things that you referenced there, I think is quite interesting, and you said at the outset, was that throwback to almost the Cold War Red Storm Rising books. Because what has been very interesting is the United States has fought low-intensity conflict, counterinsurgency operations for the last 20 years. And it seems there's almost been an entire generation of leaders that have come up in an environment that is dramatically different than the environment that you outline, that's going to necessitate that sort of adaptation. One of the takeaways I had from your book that I really enjoyed was the importance of that signature masking, that denial and deception, those very bare bones things where you're not operating in an environment where you have air dominance. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that and talk about that sort of shift in certainly American, but Western writ large, from the challenges of low intensity warfare and the advantages that we had in that to a high intensity conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and kind of where you see the biggest friction points.
Yeah, we've got a generation of leaders who's spent, a good part of 2 decades in lower level operations, which at times were quite intense, to be fair, but, dispersed lower intensity operations among the people. And there might be some of that in the Western Pacific in the future, but there's going to be far more high intensity, large scale, industrial scale warfare if, this kind of catastrophic scenario over Taiwan does eventuate. Things like air superiority, air parity, these kind of terms we haven't used for a long time, will be really important. Things like defending against mass missile and drone attacks that we've seen in Ukraine will be very relevant, not just for frontline forces, but for strategically important logistic hubs, ports, airfields, munitions dumps. I mean, Guam is a massive fuel and munitions dump, as we know. That would be a critical target in any war, I think. All these old ideas from the Second World War, particularly the war in Pacific around the importance of logistics, dispersal and scale, will come back into play, but it'll be 21st century scale, which will involve lots of ships, planes, tanks and everything else, but mass will also be generated through large numbers of autonomous systems, large numbers of long-range strike systems, and of course, mass influence operations. It's not just all about activity in the physical realm.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask it. You seem to have some fairly pointed comments to your home country of Australia and its vulnerability to Chinese influence operations, disinformation. And I'm curious, certainly for people in the audience who are not as familiar with sort of Australia's recent history of Chinese penetration, if you could talk a little about that, see where the government is today and your concerns going forward.
Yeah, I think, Australia has done a lot of very positive things and in many respects has led the world in countering Chinese political interference and influence operations since 2018. new legislation on countering foreign interference. The Huawei decision on 5G was the first one in the world about stopping Chinese 5G companies or telecommunications companies building 5G networks. That enraged the Chinese because it set an example for a lot of other countries to then look at their systems and say no as well. So I think we've done a lot of really good things that a lot of countries have looked at. And that's really upset the Chinese, which is why they're trying to reset the relationship, because all their coercion has failed against us. That said, we do have a couple of state premiers who seem to think they can undertake their own foreign diplomacy in trips to Beijing and things like this that, you know, is almost unthinkable out of a place such as the United States. And we do need to have a look at our federation, our constitution, to say, listen, if you're a state-based politician, you don't get to travel overseas and establish foreign relations. That's the job of the Commonwealth. So I guess I do have a poke at least one state, but I also have a bit of a poke at the state of our military. I mean, we've had a succession of reviews that haven't resulted in very much change. We've just had a very large review released called the Defence Strategic Review, which says a lot of interesting things, but offers not a single cent of additional funding in an environment the review describes as the most threatening we've ever had. There's a real discontinuity between what it's saying and the resourcing being provided, unlike Japan, which has just doubled its defence funding. So, you know, I hope people will look at it and say, yeah, maybe we do need to actually walk the walk instead of just talking the talk when it comes to reform of our own military forces.
If you could speak a little bit more about that, one of the things I thought was quite striking about the AUKUS Accord, which is a fantastic agreement, excuse me, in embedding the Anglosphere more closely in the Indo-Pacific. It's a sizable chunk of money, certainly for the Australian government. I think it's $386 billion over the life of the agreement. That is a substantial financial commitment. And as you rightly note, the recent reviews haven't had much in the way of forthcoming additional monies. I'm curious the direction you see, certainly under this government in Australia, but potentially a successor government, whether you're going to have an alignment of that threat perception and resource prioritization.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big supporter of AUKUS. I mean, I've always been a huge supporter of our alliance and other bits of the relationship with the United States. I mean, I think a lot of people see the Australia-US relationship exclusively through the military alliance, and I think that's unfortunate because as important as ANZUS in, there are very close economic, social, cultural links that, you know, every bit as important in my mind. Particularly, you know, foreign investment by the United States in Australia is about 10 times that of China, and a lot of people tend to overlook that. So the relationship is vital for our country. The AUKUS Pillar 1, which is the nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarines, which will roll out in several phases, you know, is a really fascinating one. You know, we're a country that doesn't build missiles, planes, tanks, but we've decided to jump straight to building nuclear-powered submarines, which is an interesting approach. The cost, you know, is 10 times what our annual defence budget is. I'm not aware of any US program that spends 10 times its annual defence budget on a single program. I mean, even the Columbia-class submarines is about only a third the cost of what the AUKUS submarines are going to cost. So, you know, it's a massive bet for a small country like, not a small country, but a medium-sized country like Australia. And that doesn't mean I'm against it, but it also means, you know, we need to think about what are the other things that we're not going to be able to spend money on because we're investing this enormous sum in a small fleet of submarines that won't be here for at least a decade or two.
Turning back to the book, one thing that spoke quite significantly to me, you know, at the center we run the National Security Space Program, which is looking at integrating commercial capabilities into the national security space architecture. Again, no spoilers, you have a very significant role for the Space Guardians in this book. And I would love your thoughts on, you know, the Space Force's evolution, where it is today and where you see it going forward, not just in America's calculation, but certainly in Australia's and the adversary's calculation, particularly China.
Yeah, this has, you know, I think been a really important area of military evolution and innovation over the last decade or so. The Chinese, when they established a strategic support force some time ago, incorporated a very large space pillar in that. With the US, you have both Space Force and Space Commands, which are different entities with very different roles in both the raise, train, sustain and force employment functions. I've visited a couple of Space Command entities out in Colorado Springs and been enormously impressed, not just by the capabilities, but the kinds of people that they're able to recruit and develop. And, we've set up our own Space Command here in Australia, which I think will only go from strength to strength. The reality is, for decades now, if you don't have space capability, you can't see, you can't talk, and you can't navigate to the kind of accuracy that we would like. It's been an invisible but an essential part of military capability for decades. We've only just recently understood how vulnerable it can be, that we have to be proactive in making sure it's an assured capability and a protected capability and isn't interfered with by the enemy. And I think that's one of the big missions now of Space Forces that they've taken on over the last few years and will be really vital in any future conflict. I mean, the real challenge is if you do get into this environment where you are taking out each other's satellite, there's a whole range of other second and third order impacts, not just with space junk, but also on civil economy, civil commerce, whether it's finance, power, other communications that we really need to think through. Now, Starlink and things like that help provide a level of assurance and resilience in space-based capability. But even then, we've seen the Russians attempt to do things to satellite networks, whether it's Viasat or even Starlink, in the last couple of years that we need to be learning from.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned Starlink. There was an online Twitter discussion today about whether or not Ukraine represented the first space war or first commercial space war, but ignoring the fact of the long legacy of commercial space supporting military and government operations. I do want to turn to Ukraine, and I think maybe space is a good starting point for this one. This is probably the most visible that we've seen commercial space in an active and war and conflict environment. I'm curious what lessons you're taking away, and your Twitter threads are fantastic, I have to say at the outset, about lessons from what's going on in Ukraine, but specifically starting with space. What are you looking at in terms of the lessons from Ukraine and the use of commercial space there? And how do you see that translating into potentially the Indo-Pacific and a broader conflict with China?
Yeah, I mean, I was just in Ukraine in March for another trip there, and I was talking about these kind of issues. I mean, Starlink specifically is an extraordinarily important capability for the Ukrainians. I won't get into the details of how they work it, but it is very important. More broadly, commercial systems are very important. And I think this is one of the transformative elements of this war is the integration and the meshing of civil government and military sensors, analytical capability and dissemination in a way that we've just not seen before. It's not just using commercial sensors and putting them in a military system. It's the whole intelligence cycle that we're seeing the meshing of military and commercial means to build a very different picture of not just the battle space, but national capacity in a way that we just haven't seen before. It's beyond OSINT. There's a not just a collection, but an analytical capability that's resident in civil community, whether it's private corporations or just citizen analysts, as we've seen, that has been brought to bear in this war in a way that is new, unique, and will carry forward. And I think a lot of governments, a lot of military institutions are going to have to relook at their own intelligence communities and architectures to incorporate that better in future. It's robust, it's resilient, it's adaptive, it's highly advanced. And I think most senior military commanders will be saying, I want more of that.
Expanding out a little bit to kind of the broader picture, and Ryan Evans had a great piece recently in War on the Rocks about the importance of certainly the United States, but its allies bedding down in Ukraine and absorbing more of the lessons and integrating them quicker and faster. I'm curious at this stage, granted, we're only a little bit over a year into this war. Certainly, Michael Kaufman has been very reluctant to make recommendations. We've hosted him and General Barno and Dr. Nora Ben-Sahel recently. A little reluctant to make recommendations on lessons learned, but I'm curious, looking at what you just mentioned about space and projecting forward, what are you seeing based on your recent trip to Ukraine about potential preliminary lessons that we could draw from this conflict and potentially apply forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been going on long enough. We actually can draw a lot of observations, and I've written about those. I mean, the real challenge is always when you're going through a lessons process, which is very formalized in many of our military institutions, is what lessons apply just to that war and what lessons are more generally applicable. And I think we've seen enough to start making some initial assessments of that. I mean, if I was to look at what the more generalized lessons that will be applicable to anyone are, firstly, close combat still matters. You can't replace close combat with long-range strike. You need both. I think that's an important lesson, and a lot of people seem to think that, the era of the tank is dead. It characterises this conversation, which we've heard people say ever since the Battle of Cambrai. It's a pretty uninformed kind of position when all you've done is spent your day watching videos of drones dropping mortar bombs on abandoned Russian tanks. If you use good equipment poorly, it's going to get plinked. If you use average equipment well with good tactics and smart people, it's not. And I'd also say there's been big disparity in the assessment of military capabilities. I don't see anyone calling for the end of manned fighter aircraft, even though Ukraine airspace has been closed to manned Russian aircraft for a long time now because of its integrated air and missile defense system, which I think is another great generalized lesson, not one specific to Ukraine, that air, missile and drone defenses are a no-brainer for deployed forces, but also strategic capabilities and logistics hubs. But I guess for me, the big lesson that, is very clear from this war is good leadership matters. We tend to forget this at times, but it's something that you have to identify. It's something you have to nurture. It doesn't just happen in any sphere of life, whether it's military, whether it's government, whether it's the private sector. And identifying good leaders, nurturing them, giving them the right opportunities, giving them the right voice has been decisive for the Ukrainians. It's been decisive for the NATO alliance and its rebirth, I think, as a result of this war. And on the other hand, it has not gone well for the Russians. They have a leadership model that clearly does not work in modern war. And, we should be looking at that going, well, what are the Chinese doing and how might this impact on how they conduct operations in the future?
That's actually another point that you quite rightly raised that I would love to get your thoughts on is we very much spend a lot of time looking at what the lessons that we should be learning from this conflict. I'm curious what you think the lessons that the Chinese government and the People's Liberation Army and even certainly the Navy and Air Forces are potentially taking away from this conflict. And then in turn, how do you think that should shape our thinking about Chinese response to this?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a fair bit of time looking at, well, how does the PLA look at this war? My first takeaway is, firstly, they do look at it closely. I mean, the 1991 Gulf War was a transformative moment for the PLA. They looked at themselves in the wake of that war and went, whoa, we've got a lot of work to do. We are not survivable in the 20th and 21st century. And a lot of the military developments that we've seen over the last 25 years from the PLA were based on their learning from the 1991 Gulf War. And other observations of wars undertaken, whether it was former Yugoslavia or in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they'll be looking at lessons around, in particular, joint integration. I mean, they've gone to great lengths to establish these theatre commands, particularly the Eastern Theatre Command, which is responsible for Taiwan, and the Southern Theatre Command responsible for the South China Sea and Southeast Asia. And how do you plan and integrate large-scale air, land, sea, cyber, information and space operations against an adversary who's very capable? That's a really important area of investigation for them. And if you monitor Chinese training activities, as I do, they're doing a lot of training to try and get at these problems. I think logistics and sustainability is another big observation, not just their own, but that of Taiwan and the United States. How do they enhance their own resilience, their own military resilience in this respect, and degrade that of an adversary? But I think they've also looked at this lesson of leadership. How do they develop the right leaders who are willing to take risks and exploit opportunity in a system that's pretty hierarchical, and one where we can see at the moment where no one is even willing to take the risk of picking up the red phone from the United States when there's a crisis, whilst at the same time the Americans and others have a mission command concept that allows them to exploit opportunity. So, these are just a couple of the lessons I think the PLA will be looking at. They won't be sitting back going, well, it's too soon to tell, like some in the West are. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think there's enough evidence, enough observation to make some informed judgments on evolving concepts, capability, and leadership and training models.
Building off of that, we just discussed what the PRC is learning from this, but what do you see? You just returned, if I'm not mistaken, from a trip to Taiwan. What are the takeaways that you heard from the Taiwanese government and Taiwanese military, and where do you see Taiwan sitting today versus where it needs to be sitting, say, in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, it was a wonderful trip, and we got to speak to a range of different government and other officials and think tanks, up to the foreign minister for about a 90-minute session, which was extraordinarily generous of them. The big takeaway that we heard from everyone is this has been a shock to the system, the Ukraine war. And the big lesson is if this can happen in Europe, it can happen in Asia. So it's about breaking through the complacency that exists in most democracies when it comes to future conflict, and make sure they have the systems and the capabilities in place to have a better chance of deterring such an outcome. I mean, they've really put their minds even more to deterring a conflict with China, given how catastrophic it would be for their people, for their economy, and the Western Pacific more broadly. So it's forced them to go back to the overall defence concept developed by Admiral Lee Simin in 2017. We spent a fair bit of time with Admiral Lee during our time, had a wonderful conversation. I'll be publishing a piece on that shortly. But they're really relooking the balance of traditional versus more asymmetric capabilities. They still need some traditional capabilities, to respond to, incursions into their airspace, into their maritime domain. But when it comes to actual warfighting, more asymmetric capabilities around long-range missiles, sea denial, drone and missile defense, these kind of things. So there's that rebalancing going on. The president of Taiwan is a supporter of this, and she's being, obviously supported by the United States government as well in this effort to rebalance the Taiwanese military in its efforts to deter Chinese aggression and the unthinkable invasion as is portrayed in this book.
Which is rather interesting because it is such a novel take on the crisis, both because it does have a very significant land component to it, which you masterfully capture. I think the sort of grittiness of the life of a soldier, that close combat, the importance of leadership, all tied up in this story, which is incredibly well done. And the other bit was the length and duration of this conflict. I remember speaking to a former intelligence officer who basically says, look, if the balloon goes up, it's over in 3 days. There's nothing we can do. Which, when I was trying to get him involved in a program, was a little disheartening because he basically kind of undermined my entire thesis for the program. But I'm particularly curious your thoughts, because of the length of duration that you have for this necessitates a rethinking of everything from supply chains and supply chain security to sea lift and airlift mobility, that these are not things that can be generated very quickly. And we've seen, as you rightly note, out of Ukraine, some conversations about expanding and increasing production lines for munitions and combat capabilities. Where do you see that happening today? Do you see the sense of urgency really being there, or are we still sort of talking a lot about it, admiring the problem, but not doing anything enough yet?
I think we're moving faster than we were a decade ago, but I don't think we're moving with a sense of urgency. Let's just describe it as we're working ourselves up to it. You know, one of the reasons I chose the ground environment isn't just because I'm a soldier, but I saw a lot of these war games about, you know, missile exchanges and ship losses and the air battle and stuff, and kind of shrugged my shoulders and went, well, okay, that's best case. What happens next? And there was none of that. And I grew increasingly frustrated with all these war games that, you know, predicted outcomes, because war games aren't about predicting outcomes. It's just not what they're for. They're about identifying weaknesses. They're not about predicting the future. And it's, you know, I think the media have misused war game outcomes as a predictive tool rather than an analytical function. So, you know, I wanted to look at something that no one else had. And it's like, well, what if we are fighting on the ground? Because ultimately, every generation flirts with death from afar or death from above as a solution to the last ugly war. The reality is that same generation always finds out that short, quick, glorious wars aren't possible when you have two large, wealthy, populous and determined opponents going at it with each other, just as we've seen from Ukraine and Russia, just as we would see in a war between China and the United States. By definition, a short war just isn't possible because the interests involved are so profound that neither has an interest in stepping back until they're seen to have been successful. So, you know, if people want to believe in the myth of the short war between large countries, good luck to them. But the reality is there's no historical evidence that proves that out. And it's really not prudent military planning to plan on two-day wars or, you know, the 100-hour wars that we fought against, you know, what was a tiny, corrupt, incompetent Iraqi military in 1991. So, you know, if we're going to be realistic about our strategic planning, about our diplomacy, economic efforts and military developments, we need to plan on this being a very long-term competition, and any war that breaks out might well be an extended one. And I think the work of people like Hal Brands and others has more eloquently described the challenge and solutions better than I ever could.
I'm very glad we actually have a question coming in from one of our senior fellows here, James Kitfield. He writes, for decades, the United States has relied on a one China policy based on strategic ambiguity over whether or not the United States would militarily defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. President Biden has reduced that ambiguity, by stating publicly multiple times that the US would defend Taiwan militarily. In your opinion, has that improved deterrence or steeled the Chinese determination to acquire capability to win such a conflict?
Yeah, no, it's been interesting to watch the President of the United States state 4 times that the US would defend Taiwan, and then the administration walk it back 3 times. So there might be some diminution of strategic ambiguity, but it's still the policy of the United States. And, you know, we shouldn't forget that when that policy was originally implemented, it was more about deterring Taiwan from declaring independence than deterring the PLA, which at that time just didn't have any of the kind of capabilities that we see today. Should we relook at the policy of ambiguity? Sure. It's like a lot of policies, you know, if the situation changes, you need to rethink your response to that. All I would say is that make sure there's a better solution for the situation before you arbitrarily get rid of this policy of ambiguity. Don't throw it out without there being a better solution. So I'm a fan of relooking policy when necessary, but I'm not a fan of just arbitrarily getting rid of it without something that replaces it that does a better job.
One of the interesting debates that has developed within the United States over the last, I'd say, sort of several weeks is an argument that's being put out there that any sort of assistance to Ukraine is distracting from and detracting from our long-term strategic competitor in China and the support to Taiwan. Where do you stand on that debate? And what is your perspective on that question?
Well, I think if you have a strategic view of that assistance, what we're doing isn't providing military aid. What we're doing is supporting a democratic country against a large predatory authoritarian regime. And that's the main message that's being sent here, that democracies are precious wherever they are and they're worth defending wherever they are, even if they're young new ones like Ukraine is. Does it take away from resources to defend Taiwan? I don't think so. I mean, if you have a look at what the US has spent so far in Ukraine, it's still a very small proportion of the annual defence budget of the United States. And as at least one or two commentators have pointed out, for 10% of the US's annual military budget, you've essentially ripped the guts out of the Russian military, and it will take them years to recover. So, I think there's a strategic good in the resources that have been allocated by the United States, the European Union, and NATO allies to the war. It's saying to countries like Russia and China that you need to think twice about preying on your neighbours. We don't like it. We are going to prevent you from doing it. And if you have any doubts about that, have a look at the support we've provided to Ukraine. We will help any other country rip your guts out as well if you want to prey on neighbouring democracies. So I think this cost that people are seeing in supporting Ukraine is a small one compared to the outcome that's being achieved by the United States and European countries.
Sticking with Ukraine right now, there's been a lot of discussion in recent days about the forthcoming spring, possibly summer offensive or counteroffensive, a lot of strategic ambiguity about what that's going to look like, what it's going to entail. Based on your recent visit to Ukraine, again, your superb analysis on Twitter, and I highly recommend everybody go check out your threads. Where do you see Ukraine's forces right now? Where do you envision them going? And what is the art of the possible going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the areas of difference in this war is those of us with military experience have taken a different view of Ukrainian capability than those who've spent their lives just analysing without that background. I'm very optimistic. We've seen the Ukrainian military learn and adapt throughout this war. Not that the Russians haven't done some adaptation, but they just haven't done it to the same quality and evenness that the Ukrainians have. And whilst both sides have lost a lot of people, that happens in large wars. And, if you have a look at World War II, the army the US started at North Africa with was very different to the one it ended on the beaches of Normandy with. Different people, different concepts, different ways of thinking. And we've seen a similar growth with the Ukrainians. They've lost a lot of people, but they've also brought in a lot of new people with a lot of new ideas. And there's still a competition between NATO and Warsaw Pact era ideas, between mobilised troops and long-term professional troops, but that's normal for any military institution in peace and war. I think what we'll see is a new Ukrainian military capability that is improved at its ability to integrate combined arms, that is better at things like combined arms obstacle breaching, which is actually the hardest military activity you can ever prepare for and undertake. And I think, as they have done throughout this war, they will surprise us very pleasantly and the Russians unpleasantly. I mean, I think there's a tendency in some countries to look at the Ukrainians through the lens of their own army. And you have to kind of set that aside. The Ukrainians aren't Americans. They're not Germans. They're not Brits. They're not Australians. They're Ukrainians. And instead of, I think, saying they need to fight more like us, I think we need to put the shoe on the other foot and say, should we be fighting more like them?
If I can pick at that a little bit more, when you say we should be fighting more like them, what do you mean specifically by that? Is it a function of we should be looking to provide them more equipment to fight, for them to fight their style? Is it integrating more of their approach to this current threat for the future, or kind of what does that look like?
Well, there's a few things that I think characterize how the Ukrainians do business. Firstly, they're very good at bottom-up adaptation and then sharing that more broadly. Tactical adaptation is a really important part in warfare, and it's how you change and improve your overall force. Secondly, I think they're very good at, linking together existing capabilities in new and creative ways. And the way they've integrated Western artillery, HIMARS, but importantly, some of the munitions that they use has been really interesting and exciting to watch. I think too, they're used to doing things on the cheap, and that's a really important way of thinking about war. Not every army is like the US Army that deploys with an Iron Mountain. In fact, most of us are not like that. So how do you fight a modern war where signature management's important, where you don't have the masses of logistic support that, say, the US Army does, and succeed? And I think the Ukrainians have offered us at least a model of doing that is well worth looking at.
Turning back specifically to the counteroffensive, I think you did a fantastic job sort of summarizing that. What do you think is achievable in the sort of coming months? And if we were to have a conversation again in a year's time, where do you envision this conflict being? I think it was General Hodges came out, with a piece recently saying that, Crimea is the decision point. That's what has to be the objective. Where do you stand on that? And where do you think the art of the possible is for Ukraine in this summer offensive?
Yeah, I've got to state up front, full disclosure, I worked for Ben when I was in the Pentagon. I love him. I thought he was one of the best leaders I've ever worked for, but he's also enormously intelligent. And, I follow Ben. He makes some big predictions at times, but on Crimea, I certainly don't disagree. I wrote, a piece on my Substack back in December. I think all roads do lead to Crimea. Now, that doesn't mean it might be resolved through a full-scale military invasion, but I think, one of the big objectives of the coming offensives will be for the Ukrainians to put themselves in a position where they can make Russian presence in Crimea untenable, just because, they can hold it at risk through long-range missiles, artillery, and things like this. At the end of the day, Crimea probably will be the final campaign of this war. How it's resolved remains an open question. It could just be through diplomacy, it could well be through military action, or it could be something in between. Ben is an experienced US Army soldier with combat experience, strategic leadership experience, and is very deeply connected throughout Europe with his work he's doing there in Germany. So, I think what he says and what he writes bears close reading. But, we should be doing that in connection with a whole lot of other analysts as well. But, I love Ben's stuff. I constantly read him, and I'm a great admirer of his personally.
We've got sort of a few minutes left here before we have to wrap up. Unfortunately, we can easily go for, I think, probably another hour and then some. And certainly look forward to hosting you when you come to DC again. I'm curious, there's a lot of fixation on the technology, the combined arms aspect. I mean, you rather talk about the aircraft. What is that thing or things that you are paying attention to, but you don't see reflected in the popular Insta punditry and the Insta experts online? What should we be paying attention to, but that we're not paying attention to when we look at Ukraine first, but then also when we talk about China and Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always look at, what's your training system and its throughput? I mean, at the end of the day, you need people to fight. How are you recruiting them? How are you putting them through a training system for basic recruit, for leadership development, for technical courses? And how are you sustaining that? There's been a lot of articles about the artillery soup and sustaining that in future. But, I think the human element is far more important. How is that working? Another area, I spoke to a lot of people about in Ukraine is, well, what is your system for collecting and sharing lessons? How do you do that? I mean, yes, there's a lot of organic grassroots sharing through both open and closed systems, but what's your military system? Because informal learning and adaptation works at the lower levels, but once you start getting to the brigade and above, you actually need formal systems. What are they? So I think, that's important. Air-land operations is an area that's kind of implied a lot. We talk a lot about F-16s, we talk about combined arms, but what about the air-land integration piece? How well is that being done? How much better might it be done? That's an area I look at because I think it's an important part of joint warfighting. The ideas that were developed as part of air-land battle, I still think are relevant in certain scenarios, and I would like to see more on that. And then I just think the strategic logistics is fascinating. What are the arrangements for the transshipment of military material through different countries? How do you speed that up? How do you speed up production of really critical munitions and pieces of equipment in a way that we haven't had to do for several generations? So, these are the kind of things I'd like to see more on. But I think there is a fairly good and a broad coverage of a lot of the areas that are of concern to, say, US policymakers and policymakers in Europe and Asia and my own country.
I want to thank you very much for joining us today. The book is, if we can get on the screen, The White Sun War. Absolutely fantastic. I strongly recommend everybody go out and pick it up. And specifically to your point about that lessons learned component, I do recall in the book a very pointed reference to the integration, adaptation, and transmission up the chain of those lessons. And I was like, that was very interesting. That was specifically highlighted. So thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation. I look forward to buying you a pint here in Washington. I'll turn it over to Representative Nye to close us out.
Well, Joshua, thank you for ably managing a very interesting conversation that went and covered a whole lot of different topic areas in different parts of the world and different levels of strategic thinking and planning and tactics. So I agree, we could certainly go on and on with this. There's a lot of content here, but General Ryan, thank you for putting the effort into the book. I'll certainly be adding White Sun War to my summer reading list and look forward to really diving into this. It sounds like a really nice intellectual journey and something we'll get a whole lot out of. So thank you for your service, but for the effort you've put into creating such a thought-provoking piece of work for us to look at. Thank you for sharing your time with us today on this call. We really have appreciated having you. And I just want to say thanks to all those who were able to join us live or able to pick up the recording. And we look forward to engaging you on further conversation soon.